She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The great iron gates of Ashford Hall would swing open, the long drive would unfold beneath ancient oaks, and he would be standing on the stone steps, waiting. His gray eyes would find hers, and something long buried would stir in their depths. Recognition. Memory. The quiet, fierce promise of a boy who had once held her hand and sworn he would never let it go. But when the carriage pulled to a halt and a footman opened the door, the steps were empty. Only a stern-faced butler stood in the archway, his gaze sliding past her traveling gown as though she were an inconvenience rather than a bride. "His Grace is occupied," he said without warmth. "I will show you to your chambers. Supper is at 8." Lillian Ashford, who had been Lillian Pemberton for barely a week, pressed one hand against the small weight that hung beneath her high-necked bodice. A tiny silver locket, warm from her skin, held a secret that had kept her alive through years of poverty and loneliness. She had worn it every day since she was 12 years old, and she had walked into this marriage believing that the man she had loved all her life would finally see her. Her fingers tightened around the locket. She stepped over the threshold alone. The hall was vast and cold. Marble floors stretched into shadow, and portraits of long-dead Ashford stared down with painted indifference. Servants moved quietly, their eyes flickering toward her and then away. She heard a whisper, something about the convenient bride, and felt a flush climb her neck. She lifted her chin and followed the butler up a sweeping staircase, each step echoing like a drumbeat of humiliation. Her rooms were beautiful, but they felt like a gilded cage. A fire crackled in the hearth. Silver brushes lay on the dressing table, and still, no sign of her husband. She unpinned her traveling cloak and sat on the edge of the bed, the locket now cradled in her palm. She clicked it open. Inside was a miniature of a woman with kind eyes, his mother, and a tiny pressed forget-me-not, brittle with age. On the inside of the lid, in a boy's uneven script, were the words she had read so often they were carved into her heart: "My promise." She had been Lillian. He had been Lucian. She was 12, he was 14, and he had nearly drowned in the lake at the edge of the Ashford estate. She had been visiting with her father, the late Baron, and had wandered to the water's edge just as Lucian's head went under. She had plunged in without thinking, grabbed his arm, dragged him to the muddy bank. He had coughed up water, looked at her with dazed gray eyes, and pulled his mother's locket from around his neck. "You saved me," he had rasped. "I'll marry you, I promise. Take this, don't forget." She never forgot. But when the fever took him afterward and the days blurred into delirium, he seemed to forget the girl with wet hair and trembling hands. She had been sent home while he was still ill, and no one ever spoke of that afternoon again. Her father died soon after, and the Pemberton fortunes crumbled. She had written to Lucian once, a careful letter that did not mention the promise, only her hope to see him again. The reply had come from his steward, cool and dismissive. The young duke, it seemed, had no time for impoverished daughters of forgotten barons. Yet here she was, his wife, married by proxy 3 weeks ago in a quiet ceremony she had not attended, arranged because the late duke's will demanded his son marry before his 30th birthday or lose the unentailed fortune. A bride of convenience, a name on a paper. She had said yes because some foolish, stubborn part of her still believed the boy who made that promise was inside the man somewhere, waiting to be woken. She was still sitting there, the locket clasped in her fingers when the clock struck 8. At supper she finally saw him. Lucian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, sat at the head of a table that could seat 30. He was tall and dark-haired, his jaw sharp, his gray eyes precisely as she remembered, except they held none of the warmth. He looked at her the way one might examine a new piece of furniture, with mild, distant acknowledgement. No curiosity, no spark. "Your journey was tolerable, I trust," he said, and it was not a question. "It was long," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt, "but I am glad to be here." He nodded once and turned his attention to the soup. Across the table, a woman laughed softly. She was golden-haired and elegant, her gown deep emerald silk, her smile a razor wrapped in velvet. Lady Margaret Denning, the Duke's widowed cousin, lifted her wine glass and studied Lillian with undisguised amusement. "You must find Ashford Hall quite overwhelming," Margaret said. "It is so much larger than a baron's country cottage. But do not fret. Country manners have their own charm." Lillian's fingers curled around her spoon. The insult was delicate, deliberate. She saw the servant's eyes flicker, and she felt the hot press of humiliation. She looked at Lucien, hopping for some small defense. He said nothing. "I have always admired grand houses," Lillian replied quietly. "They hold so many stories." Margaret's smile flickered. "Indeed they do. Some stories are best left forgotten." Something cold slipped down Lillian's spine. She did not understand it then, but she would learn. The days that followed were a slow, grinding erosion of hope. She tried. She dressed carefully each morning, learned the household routines, asked gentle questions about the estate. She lingered in the library where she knew he sometimes worked, hopping to catch his eye. Once she found him alone there, a book of poetry open in his hands, the same volume of Blake they had once read together under the willow tree by the lake all those years ago. Her heart had leaped. "You enjoy Blake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, and for a fleeting second something softened in his expression. "I did once. It feels distant now." "I remember a line," she said carefully. "And we are put on earth a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love." His gaze sharpened. "You read it well." "Someone taught me," she said, and her hand moved instinctively toward the locket. But before she could say more, Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Lucien, the steward needs you. The drainage plans for the lower fields." She cast a glance at Lillian. "Do forgive me for stealing him. I am sure you have some needlework to occupy you." Lucien closed the book and left without another word. Lillian stood in the empty library, the echo of his retreating footsteps hammering against her ribs. She pressed the locket through her dress and felt the sharp edges of the forget-me-not. Maybe, she thought, he would never remember. Maybe the boy who had promised her the world was gone forever. The first public humiliation came a week later. Margaret had arranged a tea for the local gentry, ostensibly to introduce the new Duchess. Lillian wore her finest gown, a soft lavender silk, a few seasons old but carefully preserved, and pinned her hair with silver combs that had belonged to her mother. She descended the staircase with her heart beating high in her throat, determined to be gracious, to win their approval. The ladies were gathered in the morning room. They smiled at her with tight, assessing mouths. Margaret presided over the silver teapot like a queen. "Your Grace," one of the older matrons said, "we hear you come from the Pemberton family, a fine name though sadly reduced." "My father was a good man," Lillian said. "I am proud to be his daughter." Margaret gave a silvery laugh. "Of course, pride is such a comfort when there is little else." She gestured to a delicate side table where Lillian's small embroidery bag lay open. "The Duchess is wonderfully skilled with a needle. I am certain she will show us some of her work." Lillian froze. The bag had been in her room. She had not brought it down. But there it was, and inside was the piece she had been working on in private, a handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots. Her heart. Margaret plucked it out and held it up for all to see. Charming, such small, careful stitches. One might mistake them for a child's practice. The ladies tittered. Lillian's face burned. She wanted to snatch the handkerchief back, to explain that it was a gift she had hoped to give her husband, a reminder of the flowers that had once meant something. But her voice had vanished. And then Lucien entered. He had come to greet the guests, and his gaze fell on the scene. His wife standing rigid, his cousin holding the embroidery aloft, the room humming with suppressed laughter. He looked at the handkerchief, then at Lillian's stricken face. "Margaret," he said evenly, "tea is growing cold." That was all. He did not defend her. He did not ask why she looked close to tears. He simply took a cup and turned away, and Lillian felt something vital inside her begin to wither. That night she did not come down to supper. She sat by her window, the locket open in her palm, and let the tears fall silently. She had been waiting for love that would never come. She had built her life on a promise he did not remember, and now she was nothing but a stranger in a cold house, useful only for her name. The next morning she made a quiet decision. She would stop waiting. She would stop hopping. She would not beg for a man's affection, even if that man was the one she had loved since she was a girl. She would find some other purpose, or she would break entirely. She began slowly to change. The first thing she did was dismiss her lady's maid's elaborate ministrations and dress in simple, practical gowns. She stopped lingering in the corridors hopping to encounter Lucien. She stopped brightening when she heard his voice. She took long, solitary walks to the tenant farms on the edge of the estate, introducing herself to the families who worked the land. She discovered a small, neglected schoolroom in the village and began spending her afternoons there, teaching the children their letters. She found an old herbal stillroom and revived it with dried lavender and rosemary, mixing tonics for the sick. She was kind and she was capable, and slowly the servants began to look at her differently. The tenants, too. They called her the true Duchess in quiet voices, and the title was earned, not inherited. Weeks passed. The distance between her and Lucien grew into a chasm, and she did not try to bridge it. She smiled politely at meals, answered his occasional questions with grace, and then retreated into her own world. She no longer searched his face for a flicker of recognition. She no longer wore the locket openly. She kept it hidden beneath her bodice, a private ache rather than a public hope. It was during this time that she met Thomas Haywood. He was the young physician who had recently taken over the practice in the village, a gentle, soft-spoken man with kind brown eyes and a quiet humor. He came to the hall one afternoon to check on a kitchen maid who had scalded her arm, and he found Lillian in the still room, her sleeves rolled up, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. "I had heard the Duchess was a recluse," he said, a smile in his voice, "but I find her elbow-deep in chamomile." She looked up startled and then laughed, a real laugh, the first in so long it felt foreign. A recluse with useful hands, perhaps. He stayed to talk. He asked about her herbal work, listened with genuine interest, and did not once look through her as though she were invisible. When he left, he bowed over her hand with a warmth that lingered on her skin. After that he found reasons to visit, a cough among the tenants, a question about a remedy, and Lillian, starved for simple human warmth, did not push him away. He became a friend, a steady, unassuming presence who saw her not as a convenience or an intruder, but as a woman of worth. The first crack in Lucien's indifference appeared on an evening she least expected. She had been at the schoolhouse all day and returned to the hall later than usual, her hair windswept, her hem mudded. She came through the garden entrance to avoid the formal rooms, and she was laughing softly at something Thomas had said as they had parted by the gate. Lucien was standing on the terrace, half hidden by the shadow of a pillar. He watched her walk through the rose garden, her smile still lingering, her face flushed with the cool air. He watched the way her fingers brushed a late-blooming rose, and something in his chest tightened. He did not know why. He only knew that he had not seen her laugh like that in months, had never seen her laugh like that with him. The next day at breakfast he spoke her name, Lillian. She looked up from her plate and her eyes were calm, distant. "Yes. I have not seen you at supper for some days." "I have been occupied with the tenants," she said. "There is much sickness in the village. I did not think you would notice." He noticed now. He noticed the way her voice no longer held that tremulous edge of hope. He noticed the way she did not linger, the way she finished her tea and excused herself without waiting for his leave. Margaret, seated beside him, watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. She has become quite the little saint, has she not? First the children, now the sick. One might think she is avoiding you, Lucien. He did not answer. But that afternoon he found himself walking toward the village schoolhouse, a leather-bound volume of poetry tucked under his arm, A peace offering, perhaps, though he could not name what needed mending. Through the window he saw her. She was sitting on a low stool, a child on each side, their heads bent over a slate. Her voice was patient, warm. A little girl reached up and touched Lillian's cheek without fear, and Lillian smiled, a smile so bright and unguarded that Lucien felt it like a blow. He had never been the recipient of that smile. He had never given her a reason to offer it. He turned away before she could see him. The book stayed in his hand, ungiven. Jealousy was a new and uncomfortable sensation. He did not yet have a name for it. The first true thunderclap of jealousy came a fortnight later at the Harvest Fair. The estate held the fair each year for the tenants, and Lillian had thrown herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised everyone. She had arranged the stalls, organized games for the children, and even helped bake the great harvest loaves. She stood now at the edge of the green, wearing a simple cream dress and a wreath of wheat and lavender that the village women had woven for her. She looked, one old farmer remarked within Lucien's hearing, like the spirit of the harvest herself. Lucien stood apart, as he always did, watching. He saw Thomas Haywood approach her bow and offer her a cup of cider. He saw her take it with that same warm smile. He saw the physician lean close, his hand resting briefly on Lillian's arm as he pointed out a group of children dancing. And he saw the way her face tilted up to Thomas, open and trusting, the way it never did with him. Something hot and jagged rose in Lucien's throat. He set his own cup down with a force that cracked the pottery. Margit, hovering at his elbow, followed his gaze. "Such a familiar manner with the physician," she murmured. "The tenants adore her, but tongues will wag if she is not more careful. A duchess and a country doctor. It would be tragic if her reputation suffered." "Her reputation is beyond reproach," Lucien said, more sharply than he intended. "Is it? She spends a great deal of time away from the hall. One wonders what comfort she finds elsewhere." He did not dignify that with a reply, but the seed Margit had planted took root. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the image of Lillian's face turned toward another man. He thought of her silence, her absence, the way she no longer sought his company. He thought of the locket he had glimpsed once, a small silver flash beneath her collar, and the way she had covered it quickly when she saw him looking. What secret was she hiding? And why did the thought of it make him feel as though the ground were shifting beneath his feet? Days later, a storm blew in from the moors, wild and sudden. The wind howled around Ashford Hall, and the rain came down in sheets. Lillian had been at a tenant's cottage, helping to deliver a baby, and she had not returned by nightfall. Lucien stood at the library window, watching the lashing rain, his heart beating in a hard, unfamiliar rhythm. He sent servants to search, but they returned without word. Finally, he pulled on his greatcoat and went himself, his boots sinking into the mud as he half ran toward the village. Fear was a cold hand around his throat. He did not know when she had become essential. He only knew that the thought of her lost in the storm was unbearable. He found her on the path, soaked and shivering, one arm wrapped around a frightened stable boy she had guided through the dark. She looked up as his lantern light fell on her, and her eyes were wide with exhaustion. "Lucien," her voice was thin. He could not speak. He pulled her against him, wrapping his coat around her trembling frame, and held her as though she might vanish. The stable boy stared, but Lucien did not care. He felt the rapid beat of her heart against his chest, and something inside him cracked open. "I thought you were lost," he said, his voice raw. "I thought." She pulled back slightly, searching his face. "You came for me." "Of course I came for you." The words were torn from him. "You are my wife." Her expression flickered. For a moment he thought he saw the ghost of the old hope there, but it was quickly buried. "A wife of convenience," she said softly. "You need not trouble yourself." She stepped back, and the rain filled the space between them. That night, after she had been wrapped in blankets and warm tea and the household had settled, Lucien walked into her empty sitting room. He did not know why he was there. He told himself he was checking that the windows were secure against the storm, but his feet carried him to the small writing desk where she kept her few personal things. A brush, a ribbon, a small, polished wooden box. He opened the box. Inside lay the silver locket. His breath stopped. He lifted it with trembling fingers and pressed the catch. The miniature of his mother smiled up at him, and beside her the dried forget-me-not flaked into fragile petals, and the inscription, "My promise, L," in his own boyhood hand. The world tilted. He saw it all then as if a veil had been ripped away. The lake, the cold water, the girl with wet hair and desperate strength who had pulled him to safety. The locket he had pressed into her palm, the promise he had made with all the fierce sincerity of a 14-year-old boy. He had forgotten. The fever had stolen it, and for 12 years she had carried his promise alone. His legs gave way. He sank onto the chair, the locket clutched in his fist, and a sound escaped him that was half groan, half sob. What had he done? Every cold glance, every dismissive word, every moment he had left her to suffer Margit's cruelty, it crashed over him in a wave of searing guilt. He had let her believe she was nothing. He had let her fade into the background while the woman who had saved his life withered under his own roof. And there was more. A darker, sickening piece of the puzzle slid into place. Margit. It was Margit who had appeared at his bedside when the fever broke, who had let him believe, in his confusion, that she had been the one to raise the alarm. She had never said she pulled him from the water, but she had never corrected his assumption. Over the years, she had woven a lie of indebtedness around him like a net, and he had been too blind to see it. He thought of Lillian's face when she had first arrived, the hope that had flickered in her eyes. He thought of how she had stopped trying, how she had turned to the tenants, the children, the physician, for the warmth he had withheld. A terrible, cold fear seized him. He might have already lost her. She might have given up on him entirely. The morning came gray and heavy. Lillian was in the garden, standing by the old stone wall that overlooked the lake. She did not turn when she heard his footsteps. She knew, somehow, that this moment had been coming. "You were the girl," he said, his voice hoarse. "At the lake, you saved me, I gave you the locket." She closed her eyes. "Yes." "Why did you never say?" "I tried." Her voice was steady, but it cost her everything. "I tried 100 ways," I hinted. "I asked. I wore the locket where you might see it. But every time I came close, you turned away. You had no memory of me. And I realized that if you could forget something that meant the world to me, then perhaps I was never meant to be in your life at all." He moved closer, his shadow falling across her. "Lillian, I was ill. The fever took my memories of that day. I woke believing Margit had been the one to help me. She let me believe it. All these years I thought I owed her a debt. I never knew." She turned then, and her eyes were wet. "You let her humiliate me. You let her take my place in every room. I came here believing the boy I loved was still inside you, and you looked at me like a stranger." He reached for her, his hands trembling. I know, I have been a fool, a blind, proud fool who did not see what was right in front of him, but I see now. Please, I see you." She shook her head, stepping back. "Seeing me now does not erase the months I spent invisible. I stopped waiting for you, Lucien. I had to. It was breaking me." The words hit him like stones. He had been so focused on his own cold distance that he had never imagined the cost. He had wanted a marriage of convenience, and she had paid the price in solitude. "I will spend the rest of my life making it right," he said, his voice cracking. "I do not ask for your forgiveness yet. I ask only for a chance." Before she could answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. Margit stood at the garden gate, her face twisted with fury. The locket, Lucien still held it in his hand, and Margit's eyes fixed on it with the panic of a cornered animal. "That trinket," she spat. "It means nothing. She found it somewhere. She is trying to entrap you." Lucien turned to face her, and his expression was no longer that of a man under a spell. It was cold, and it was final. "You lied to me for 12 years. You let me believe you were my savior. You tormented my wife in her own home. Your presence here is ended." Margit's mask shattered. "You cannot cast me out. I have given you years of devotion. You have given me years of deception." His voice was quiet and unyielding. "You will pack your belongings and leave by sunset. If you ever set foot on Ashford land again, I will see you prosecuted for fraud and defamation." She screamed, she wept, she threatened. But in the end, she went. The carriage rolled down the long drive, and the house seemed to exhale for the first time in a decade. That evening, Lillian sat in the small sitting room she had made her own. Lucien knocked softly and entered only when she bade him. He looked exhausted, his cravat loosened, his hair disheveled. He knelt before her chair, an act no duke would perform lightly. "I know I do not deserve your love," he said. "I know I have been cold and careless and blind, but I remember now. I remember the water and the cold and your voice telling me to hold on. I remember the promise I made, and I have never stopped being that boy who loved you, even when I did not know it." She looked at him, at the face that had haunted her dreams since she was 12 years old. The hard lines had softened. The gray eyes that had once looked past her now looked into her with an aching vulnerability. "You hurt me," she whispered. "You made me feel like nothing." His head bowed. "I know, and I will carry that weight forever. But I am asking, with every broken piece of me, if you will let me try to be the man you deserved all along." The silence stretched, fragile as spun glass. Then she reached out and touched his cheek. It was a small gesture, but it held the seeds of forgiveness. "I have loved you for so long," she said. "I do not know how to stop, but I need time. I need to learn to trust that you see me, truly see me." He pressed his lips to her palm. "Take all the time you need. I will be here. I will prove it every day for as long as I live." The weeks that followed were quiet and tender. He did not crowd her. He did not demand. He simply showed up. He walked with her to the village. He sat in the schoolroom and read to the children in a voice that made the little ones giggle. He asked her about her herbal remedies, and he listened. He sent Margit's belongings to a distant relative and had the west wing aired and opened, no longer a place of shadow. He wore no locket of his own, but she caught him once touching his chest where the silver chain used to rest, and she understood. One evening, as autumn blazed gold across the park, they stood together by the lake where it had all begun. The water was still, reflecting the amber sky. He took her hand and lifted it to his heart. "I loved you too late," he said, "but I love you with everything I have, and I will love you until the world ends." She looked at the water, at the willow tree, at the boy she had saved and the man who had finally returned to her. She opened the locket, still warm around her neck, and took out the dried forget-me-not. She tucked it into his palm. "Then remember this time," she said, "and do not forget again." He pulled her close, his lips against her hair, and he made a new promise. Not out of boyish impulse, but out of the steady, bone-deep certainty of a man who had nearly lost the most precious thing in his life and had been given a second chance. And this time he would never, ever let her go. The healing took time, but it took root. Laughter returned to Ashford Hall, real laughter, the kind that comes from a heart no longer afraid. The tenants prospered under their duchess's care, and the Duke was seen not as a distant lord but as a man who walked among his people with his wife's hand in his. The schoolroom grew, and Thomas Heywood remained a dear friend, but the love that bloomed between the Duke and his Duchess needed no rival. It was quiet and steady and unshakable. Years later, their own children played by the lake, and Lillian told them the story of a girl who saved a boy, and a promise that survived time and forgetting. She wore the silver locket still, and inside, beside the miniature, there was now a fresh forget-me-not, replaced every spring by the Duke himself. And he never once looked through her again. He looked at her always as if she were the sun and he the earth, finally, gratefully in her orbit.